So, at the 2013 Rotary District Conference, this club's Domestic Violence Solutions Committee set up a walk-through community education tool that's called In Her Shoes, where participants do, move, think, and experience the lives of battered women. A couple, I was standing there, and a couple approached me after going through the experience. Their names are Don and Liysa Swart, and I just found out today actually that Don has been a Rotarian with perfect attendance for 32 years. I know, he was going to be here, he couldn't be here today. But I didn't even realize what I just said. But that's from his club, which is the Wallowa County Rotary Club. So he's still good there. Well, anyway, they approached me, and they very quietly and very eloquently told me about their daughter-in-law. They told me how she had recently been released from prison after shooting and killing her former husband in order to protect her and her children from continued domestic abuse. As any true Rotarian would do, I offered my support to them, and I gave them my contact information, and I asked them to pass it on to their daughter-in-law, Liysa Swart, in case she was looking for some support. Soon after, Liysa did reach out to me, and together, first with Anne-Marie Florello, and then with Amy and the entire DV Solutions Committee, we talked about how we could best share her story and the work that she is now doing to bring awareness and advocacy for those who are currently existing with domestic abuse in their lives. And that's how we get to today. Liysa's Swart career ranged from working as a research diver, as a home designer, to becoming an award-winning writer, photographer, and cinematographer. Her work has appeared in hundreds of magazines, books, and movies. She graduated from the University of Hawaii in 1985 and is the only woman in the world ever awarded the contract to shoot the Triple Crown of surfing from the water, which she did for many years. She performed stunts for Baywatch, and she did extensive modeling. In October of 2000, she shot and killed her charming but abusive husband after he repeatedly assaulted and threatened to dismember her children and her. She spent 12 years in prison, where she was certified as a paralegal, organic gardener, in small business management and nonviolent communication, and she was released just over a year ago. Since her release, she has pursued her photography, and she's become a certified personal trainer and yoga instructor. She works with the nonprofit organization Voices Set Free in domestic violence advocacy and education. She lives in Eagle Creek with her husband, who's here today, Rick Swart, Rotarians and guests, Liysa Swart.
Good afternoon. I'm here to talk to you about a dirty little secret, and it's called domestic violence. Unfortunately, it's an epidemic, and this epidemic grows under a shroud of silence and shame. I've become an expert in this field, not by choice, but I've chosen to share the pain that I've endured, to speak for others who cannot because they're either silenced through fear of their batterers, or because an unjust system keeps them from speaking out, or because their batterers themselves have silenced them. So first of all, Kate did a really good job of introducing me, but I'll click to who I was at one point. I haven't ever used this. There we go. Photographer, model, stunt person. I did PT 14 times with my child before I went to prison because there's a perfect wave there called cloud break. And the most important part of my life was my role as a mother. My children meant everything to me. So I traveled around the world, and I took my kids with me, and I had a wonderful life and met a textbook awesome man, and I got that from Kala. But unfortunately, he was a batterer, and I didn't know that when I married him. perfect. And things quickly went south. He beat me up. When I was pregnant, I ran to my friend's ranch in California. I didn't use credit cards, but it took him only 3 days to find where I was and threatened to burn down their house unless I came back. I was horrified that I was jeopardizing my friend's safety who were sheltering me, and I did come back. After that, I went to the police and asked what I could do, and they told me that there was nothing. Their hands were tied. So I became a Stepford wife and tried to be a good girl as much as I could. When my son was 2 months old, my husband slammed my head against the wall and beat me up, and I just said I'd had it, and I was leaving. I packed up the car, and he grabbed my baby and ran back into the house, and of course I chased him into the house, and he strangled me to the blackout point. And as I was losing consciousness, my last thought was, who will protect my children now that I'm dying? And, sorry. I regained consciousness with my oldest son, who was 5 at the time, screaming at me to wake up and brushing my face with a hairbrush. I ran to the phone and dialed 911, and my husband pulled the phone out of the wall. What I didn't realize is that the police would trace the call and come anyway. And when they did, I was so relieved because he had almost killed me. And I was already starting to plan how I would rebuild my life with him in prison. When the police asked me what had happened, I was bleeding and crying. My child was hysterical because he had seen his mother, for all intents and purposes, murdered in front of his eyes. Then they went in and interviewed my husband in the house, and 20 minutes later they were still in there. So I went in and was shocked to see them laughing and joking with my husband, the pilot, and he was showing them the different models of airplanes that he flew. And they looked at me like, oh, we forgot about you. And I just stood there horrified. They patted him on the back and said, you just need to go get some counseling. I've been through this too. And they drove off. What that told me is that I was never getting any help. What that told my husband is that he could do as he pleased without consequence. And he did. So for the next 3 years, my children watched as I was thrown from a moving car, beaten, strangled, and sometimes he would go after them because that was more painful for me than when he hit me. So, after years of this and trying solutions ranging from asking to be put in the witness protection program because he threatened to kill me if I testified against him, the only time he was arrested, which is when an emergency room doctor pressed charges against him. And this emergency room doctor was also a victim of domestic violence, which is why she knew I was lying when I said I got my injuries from skiing. Anyway, witness protection is not available if you are a domestic violence victim. I also was told that I would get kidnapping charges if I took my children with me if I fled the state. Anyway, to make a long story short, after he threatened to chop my children into pieces so that they would never find the bodies, I shot him and killed him. And then I became inmate number 139-485-11. So this was the last time I saw my children and got to touch them for more than a year. And this is the last time I ever held them for more than 3 seconds at a time, because in prison that's the limit. And then the picture on the right is what they looked like when I got out of prison. They had grown up without their mother, but they had indeed grown up. When I first got to prison, there was a guard that used to stare at me a lot. And finally I confronted her and said, What do you want? And she said that she looked at me and I could be her, or she could be me, because her boyfriend was threatening to kill her and she didn't know what to do. And I told her the things that I had been through and how the DA in my case had not even considered what I'd gone through abuse. And I said, in this state, it's either handcuffs or a headstone. She, being a guard, could not even conceive of being in prison because she knew how horrific that was. And she said, there's got to be another solution. I said, well, when you think of it, let me know, because I spent 4 years trying to come up with something, and I hope you do. We had this conversation in February. In April, they moved all of the female inmates to Coffee Creek from Pendleton, where I had been. And in July, he killed her. Her name was Renee Melendrez. She was a mother of 3 children, and her death did not even make the front page of the paper. The reason why is that in the time that I spent in prison for defending my life and my children's lives, more than 400 women and children in this state have been killed by their batterers. We're so used to it that it's not even news. So I spent the next decade trying to find that solution that neither Renee Melendrez or I could come up with, because what happened to her she did not deserve what happened to her, and I did not deserve what happened to me. The state of Oregon has the second worst record for violence against women in the whole United States. Women and children die average at a rate of 1 per week. 20,000 calls for help go unanswered in this state because we don't have the funding to help these women. And then there are dangerous myths that perpetuate some of the struggles for the battered women. And these are primarily, and I'll go into these, that you can't be a victim of domestic violence if you have a job. And also that you could just leave. And I'll talk about this a little bit more later. But what I found out is that nobody in the state of Oregon is enforcing the Violence Against Women Act. And I was at a symposium with Hardy Myers, who was the former Attorney General for the state of Oregon, who was in charge of prosecuting me. And he watched the film that Delphine made about me, and afterwards he came and apologized to me for the state of Oregon's failure in my case. And that apology doesn't bring back the years I lost with my children, and I'm still on parole. But what it does do is it creates some recognition that there is no enforcement and that needs to change. Strangulation and the things that my husband did to me would have put my husband in prison for 70 years in Connecticut, for example. In Oregon, it got him a pat on the back. One of the reasons is that former police chief Penny Harrington admitted that 40% of police officers themselves are batterers. So these guys are not enforcing the Violence Against Women Act. An abuse shield law could really help change these statistics. So who are the victims of domestic violence? Well, it's everybody. It's 1 out of 3 women. Probably 1 out of 3 women in this room. 60% of the victims are working. They're employed. And these people are doctors and lawyers, teachers. They're everybody. They're your neighbors. Who are abusers? They're charming. They're your neighbors. They're people you know because they create a public persona of awesomeness. And it's a deliberate attempt. One of my friends was going, no, don't put Sean in it, I love him. Exactly, that's the point. These men in public are great. And so that's one of the reasons that victims get scapegoated and shamed and not believed. In private, these are the men that we deal with, because behind closed doors, this is who we deal with. We deal with batterers. So people think, why doesn't she just leave? Well, you can get charged with kidnapping if you take your children. leaving or right after you've left is when 75% of women, and sometimes their children, are killed. 92% of homeless children belong to mothers who are fleeing domestic violence, and this brings a whole new set of risks. Family court judges often do not understand that unsupervised visitation with the batterer puts children at risk of being battered at a 60% higher rate. So women will stay to protect their children. If you have connection to the community, your jobs, your children's school, that puts you at risk of exposure to a batterer. So even if you live in a shelter, just your normal life, they can find you. And if you're married to a man who's well-connected, it's very easy for him to track you down. So these are some of the reasons that domestic violence victims stay, but they get blamed for that. I called a shelter at one point, and they said based on the fact that he strangled you and threatened to kill you, you're at very high risk of being a homicide victim, and it's safer to placate and stay sometimes, because if you leave, it will trigger a homicidal event. So what are other states doing better than we are doing? Well, number one, they have a mandatory protocol on domestic violence arrests or calls. The police are required to interview children and neighbors to see if there's a pattern of abuse, and they arrest the primary aggressor. In Oregon, what happens so often is that a man will be choking a woman and there aren't marks, but she will pick up a weapon or scratch him and she will be the one arrested. In these other states, abuse and imminent danger are determined from the past pattern of abuse. Washington State and many others have said flat out that it is unconstitutional to expect a smaller woman to fend off a larger man without a weapon. That's what Oregon does. They expect that you are automatically arrested on a Measure 11 if you pick up a weapon. It doesn't matter if the man is bigger or not. And that's something that has to change. They also prosecute terroristic threatening. For example, when my husband said he was going to chop us into little pieces, that would have been 5 to 20 years in most states. So if there had been early intervention, it would have prevented the larger tragedy later. Finally, many states have mandatory batterer intervention classes or programs. And these help because it's kind of a come to Jesus moment. It's like, okay, early on, I won't lose my career, I won't lose these things. And they gain tools and also accountability. Oregon does not mandate this. There are a couple of counties that do, but it's not a statewide directive. And we particularly need it in the rural counties where it's really the old boy system. So, some of the solutions, and what I would like to see is a comprehensive abuse victim shield law, because all of these work in tangent with each other to have broad education in the beginning so that you prevent the more expensive and more tragic consequences down the line. So this is education, which is mandatory for all state of Oregon employees, and they need to be tested on it. So they can't just say, yeah, I watched the video. They need to make sure that they understand not that, but also what their job is in this. And Hardy Myers is the one that suggested that. He said, why don't, people need to know exactly what their role is. Because there's so much confusion. I mean, when you have a DA that says it's not abuse when you've been thrown out of a moving car and strangled, and it's like, that's not abuse. There's a problem. So, mandatory batterer intervention programs for all domestic violence calls, whether there's an arrest or not. Because a lot of times women are just too afraid to prosecute, but if these classes were required, it could prevent a lot of future tragedy. We need uniform legal definitions for what is imminent danger and what is abuse. And these need to be determined from the past pattern. We need for the police to do mandatory investigations. And strangulation should be deemed attempted murder because that's what it is. If you've ever been strangled, you are dying. For it to be a misdemeanor, they recently changed the legislation so that it can be a felony if children are present. That doesn't protect everyone. it's attempted murder. We also need to have terroristic threats prosecuted and without bail, because the only time my husband was arrested, it took him about an hour to come to my house and threaten to kill me. So you can't just catch and release these guys when they threaten to kill you. No woman fleeing domestic violence should be arrested for kidnapping, just for taking her children. We need a task force with sanctioning power so that DAs, judges, and policemen that do not follow the tenets of the Violence Against Women Act get in trouble for that. They don't get a pass. Too many women are dying, and it's on them. No victim of domestic violence who fights back should be charged without a grand jury indictment, and this grand jury should be a DV-informed panel. And finally, when a survivor does go to prison who has PTSD or battered women syndrome, she should be diverted to a rehab program like the veterans are recently being diverted. So, I want to make it clear that men are not the enemy. I have a father and father-in-law I love dearly. I've got a fantastic husband, and even though this Wallowa County redneck, is, captain of the football team, boy hero, he's the most adamant feminist I know, because he believes that women deserve equity, and that's the definition of a feminist. So we aren't against men. We need to work together, all of us, to create these solutions. And what people, I think a lot of the men in the legislature are afraid of is that, oh, this is going to be open season on men. This is, they're afraid. But what happened is when the Violence Against Women Act passed, the deaths of men went down because females finally thought, oh my gosh, I'm not going to have to do this myself. I will be protected. So the men's deaths went way down. Unfortunately, the Violence Against Women Act wasn't enforced, so the women's deaths have been going way up. I think if we have enforcement, both will go down. And why should that matter to those of you who aren't victims? Well, if the human suffering isn't enough that we will be preventing, these solutions can save the state of Oregon millions of dollars a year. And here's how. I'm not going to talk about all the numbers. You can look there for yourself. But basically, every woman who's in prison for defending herself costs the state of Oregon $600,000. There are over 600 women at Coffee Creek that are there on Measure 11s. And if we can divert just 10 of these, that's $6 million. If we can divert half of them, that would save the state $180 million. So at Voices Set Free, on just less than it costs to even prosecute one woman, in Multnomah County, it's an average of $108,000. So on a budget of less than that, we help 100 families avoid the justice system, avoid re-entry into the justice system. So you can look at those numbers for a second. And then what can you do? You can support this legislation or any legislation that helps the plight of domestic violence survivors. And you can call your representatives and ask for a domestic abuse shield law. And right now we're working on actual wording of legislation that we want to propose. You can hire a survivor of domestic violence because economic instability is a critical factor for a lot of these women. Donate to a domestic violence program, shelter, time, anything you've got. The need is really, really dire. Hold your friends accountable. Don't let them joke about domestic violence. And if you hear somebody being verbally abusive, call them on it right then and there. Because it's that tacit climate of acceptance that lets this fester. And finally, if someone you know is being abused and tells you about it, believe them. Because not being believed and being blamed and scapegoated and lied about, which batterers lie, they try to protect their reputation. That's a form of re-victimization. for children, for the women. And actually, I should make a point. It's not only women who are victims of domestic violence. It exists in lesbian and gay relationships. There are men who are victims, but primarily it's an issue of power and control, and it's overwhelmingly male over women violence. So it's not exclusively. That's just the largest number. So thank you, and I really want to applaud the Rotary Club because I know that you take this issue seriously. You have a wonderful track record, and I'm just so proud of you for making this an important issue and putting some energy into this. And it's through people like you that this will change, and I believe that we can change this soon. So that's all I've got. If you want more information, I've got it. There's some flyers in the back. Delphine's film, you can get that. It's a short one, about 12 minutes, and sometimes it's easier for people to talk about it when it's about somebody else than themselves, so it's a good talking point. Thank you.
Maybe you could shed a little bit more light on how this came to be that we've been so negligent in providing those protections in the state of Oregon, and if there's any recent history of attempts to try to put laws on the books to protect women, and what's it going to take to get it done. Of course, we'd love to write letters to our legislators, but I'm really interested in knowing where is the movement to support this and what's the status of that?
I to Salem and talk to them, and the resistance has really been from male legislators. They're afraid. And the strangulation law, it recently, last session, got changed from being a mere misdemeanor to a felony in the case when children are present. And that was a rider on lots of other bills, and what would happen is that they would need something trimmed from the budget, and so that would be the thing that would get trimmed. And so it just constantly just kept not getting passed. And at one point they thought, well, it would be too expensive if we make this a felony. And it's like, oh, really? That's your concern? So that's why I'm thinking if we have a comprehensive shield law, it will be pretty hard for them to defend not passing this because it won't be attached to anything else. And there's huge economic incentive to do this. So yeah, I know calling your legislator might seem like a drag, but that's what it's going to take, and say, we want this, and we're not voting for anybody who's not behind it.
Assuming you're successful at these parts you're talking about, my other concern is about those folks who are so beyond sanctions that they're willing to take themselves down at all costs. The, what do they call it? The restraining orders are laughably ineffective. And I don't know what that solution is because these people are willing to die in the process. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Because my husband was at the point where he didn't care when he was ready to drive off a cliff with my children and I because my stepfather refused to shake his hand. He knew the jig was up, he would be exposed. And he was willing. He was past the point. So what that happens is we shouldn't be punishing women for protecting ourselves because we know when it's like that. We know when they're at that point. And so that's my solution. When you're forced to defend yourself, that's justifiable homicide. And so the other thing is the prison superintendents have said that their main directive is rehabilitation. That's their mandate. Domestic abuse survivors who have fought back and protected themselves have a 0% recidivism rate. 0%. So these women are not receiving any rehabilitative programs in prison. They're simply being warehoused in the most horrific conditions you can imagine. And that's not doing anybody any good. It's $31,000 a year to warehouse these women. If we diverted them into the PTSD programs like the veterans, it would cost a fraction of that. And that's the last solution. If we can get early intervention, education, so that it's a very small minority of these people that are just past reaching. So when victims protect themselves, they shouldn't be punished.